1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. We are going to be taking a look at this. And, as I said, I appreciate the lesson we just covered. But we're going to be now going through it in greater detail and moving forward with this. And make sure and keeping it more directly in context for our purposes. And so now the thing is for those who are here at the 9 o'clock, that means that when I ask questions and you don't know the answers, I'm taking that to Eddie. I'm going to say they're not paying attention enough. You need to do something about this. But when we go through, we'll take a look. Because this is such a familiar text, we probably hear this read more from any text in 1 Corinthians. And it is, to some degree, taken from what the gospel accounts are. So we see this then as being central, rightfully so, to what we do and what we will do this morning in partake of the Lord's Supper. So I hope that while we're dealing with the familiar here today, that perhaps we will be able to think about it in multiple ways. My job now is to kind of enhance what's already been introduced. So let's begin then in verse 23. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Now just consider what we covered last week as we are placing the Lord's Supper now within the problem context of Corinth. That he has been dealing since chapter 8 with issues where they've been affected by the culture around them, and that is where this falls. So that what we looked at, verses 17 through 22, were their failings in how they were conducting themselves when they came together, and you see here an important distinction. He says, when you come together, it's not to partake of the Lord's Supper. You clearly have a different purpose in what you're doing when you are bringing this food. You're thinking of something else. You're thinking of your stomachs. You're thinking of your social life. You're thinking of your little group. He says, that's not the right thing. And so when we come to verse 23, he is laying down a major contrast that he set up with their behavior. And we noted that he said it was not good, and that was in contrast to what he had told them regarding their conduct regarding the veils, going back to verse 2. So we have here a different kind of problem, and it's going to be the last one. He's kind of been moving toward this the whole time, and we can know that because he foreshadowed this discussion in chapter 10 about what they were partaking of in the Lord's Supper. So it was already on his mind in chapter 10 as an example that he just kind of puts out there. And then he goes back into the principles, and then he goes into one application with the wearing of the veils, and now he's back to deal with the problem. And that is, while the first had to do more with just an understanding about this is not a pagan thing, now he says, okay, let's talk about what you're doing. There's a problem here. And having addressed that, then, he's going to now offer the corrective. But we have to appreciate, I think it'll draw out a few more things to note, verses 17 through 22, about the nature of the problems they were having with it. That they had treated it as a common meal, that they were divided up in the way in which they did it. That's going to come up later on, and we're going to see an important aspect of it because of that. But now, we look at the text itself before us, again, very common, and we want to kind of look at each phrasing to maybe, I hope, notice some things we don't often notice. The first thing, if you look here in verse 26 then, he says, For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you. Now, I want you to stop and think about what that implies for them. this is just explaining communication, right? But what did he establish here? Good. I didn't give you anything that was just my idea. This is something I got from the Lord. So if you go back and you think about in Galatians 1, where Paul talks about how he was directly instructed by the Lord, Paul, remember, was not at this event. So Paul himself had to be instructed about it. Whereas the other apostles, other than Matthias, they were actually there. So he's been instructed separately. He received it then as instructions in a different way than what those the 11 had. But the last part when he says, that which I also delivered to you. Now when he says that he had delivered it to them, I gave it to you. What does that mean then? Say that louder, Sandra. You should know. You don't have an excuse, people. I already told you from what the Lord told me. I told you what you're supposed to do. Not sure how you managed to mess it up, but you managed. That's the implication. Is that I already gave this to you. So the nature of what he says here about why he's coming back to it, and there's a greater problem, is you already have been told. So I'm having to revisit this issue and remind you of it, and therefore he's spending time both in correction before telling where the problem is, but now centering in, this is what it's all about, and then he's going to get more correction with instruction mixed after this. But now, with that in mind, he had to kind of come back and revisit the issue. Okay? What did he have to revisit? That the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Now we know when that was. It was the Passover meal. He is observing that. And they are then, after that meal, and after he does this, if you look carefully at the timeline, remember, you had the meal and Judas dipped his bread in, and that was basically when he left. And it was at that portion when all of this takes place, shortly afterwards. And Judas is gone. So while Judas is gone to betray Jesus, and to have that discussion, that final discussion, and to lead them to him, when Judas leaves to do this, Jesus is introducing a memorial to his death. He's anticipated. Now, it's more than that, but I want you to think about where Jesus' mind was in doing this. He's doing it for purpose for which we still have benefit. He's introducing this on the night before he dies. He's choosing to already bring this up to make sure this is in place, and it's going to be contextualized by everything that happens in the next few days. So he's already thinking ahead to what's about to happen as he's saying this. When we see these words, Jesus saying them, I don't often think we consider what had to be on his mind as he's saying them. For him, this was said in a moment of anticipation of what the next 24 hours, and actually less than that, were going to be like for him, which he knew very well. So he took bread. Now, again, we know what was going on. We know what that would have been because of what they were doing. So if they were celebrating the Jewish Passover, then he's using what was there. And this matters quite a bit for us in terms of just basic doctrine. Because what all did they have available to them during Passover at the Passover meal? Does anyone have any idea? They had unleavened bread, had bitter herbs, and they had the lamb because of the meal, because of the sacrifice, and then they had to drink the fruit of the vine with grape juice. And one of the reasons why, when you go back to why they did this, of course, all the way back to Exodus 13, 12 and 13, it was designated specifically of that they were to be, remember, preparing for a journey, and it was going to be this that would keep and those kind of things, that it designated certain things about it for them at that time. It was tied in with their deliverance even then. Okay, so if you have originally that meal that they're having, he selects only certain things from it. Okay? That's why I wanted to bring up that there was more there on the table. He chooses two things without including the others. So he is selective, meaning that his choices, what he chose to include, we should respect. It's not just for all of it. That's actually pretty key in terms of interpretation. But he takes the bread. It would have been unleavened bread because they didn't allow leavening agents in. That was one of the things they were to get out of their house. So now verse 24 then, he took the bread then, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said. Now, this is process, and so he gives thanks. So we know that he is, what's he doing when he gives thanks? He's offering a prayer, okay? And for what is he praying at that moment? He's giving thanks. It's thanks for this. I mean, that's specifically for what that means that he has this. But they've already had the meal. We're going to get to that in a second. But so I don't know how many men, when I'm afraid that one of the reasons why people are a little bit leery of serving and praying for the Lord's Supper is they're just afraid of saying, and blessed to the nourish of our bodies. I'm just convinced that that's one of the great fears of saying that, because it's not the right place. It's out of place for purpose. But there is something about giving thanks for what we're doing, and for he's beginning this, that it's appropriate for prayer. This is made possible by God. It's available to us. And so the giving of the prayer is he's anticipating. Remember, his mind is on everything. In giving thanks for the bread, the next thing he's going to say is what this bread actually represents. There is a little bit of a clue about they're not going to appreciate this at the moment. How many things do you realize that the disciples just didn't appreciate when they heard it the first time? You see that multiple times through their training. Here, with where we know their minds were, even though Jesus had telling them he was going to Jerusalem to die, they had all sorts of other meanings in mind in their head about that. And so when he says these words, we need to keep in mind that they weren't there yet. He is trying to get them there, but he's also anticipating all of this without re-walking them through everything he's already said. So when he is praying, it says he broke it. What does it mean that he broke it? Because this has become, for some, this is a real big issue. Wow. First of all, let's just deal with the language part of it. When you hear break bread, we've taken that into the language. We say, well, let's break bread. The Christians will get together and break bread. The idea of they did it to break bread, and he brought this up, that was described as the Lord's Supper in a figure encompassing the whole synecdoche. Well, what does it do when he does this? What does it mean to break? I mean, essentially, yeah, it's the idea of, for him, they would have taken a peel off. They they didn't go in there and say, grab me a piece of bread. We say that because ours is already sliced. Right? It's not sliced bread. Right? So you're having to get that when he breaks it, right? You're breaking off a piece of bread. Otherwise, I mean, seriously, you're going to break bread? You can throw that thing on the ground, you can hit it. You don't break bread in a kind of traditional sense, right? You're breaking off a piece. Okay? So we accept the language, but we don't always think through the nature of it. Well, what does he do when he says it broke? Some people then, we're going to give thanks. He broke it, and there have been times in which in congregations, you'll have a fight over whether or not, after you have the prayer, if the people must then break it up and distribute it, rather than already being pre-broken up. Yes, you're in trouble because you don't get a choice here. Yes, no. This is a legitimate issue that's been brought up before at places, John. Yeah. Yes, but he's going to get more into that in a moment. He's doing what had to do for them to be able to partake, right? Okay, but this is what we have to make sure and recognize, that why you can understand why you'd have that question if you're just reading through this. He gave thanks, and then he broke it, and then they partook. So we don't want to leave it. I just want to point out that this comes from the right kind of heart. We want to do things the way that the Scripture says to do things, but it's a failure to understand, appreciate what actually was being done and why. And in the end, if we're just, since he was taken off so that they could be able, each one, to have some, okay? In the process of taking and instituting something from a meal, it's a practical effect versus being simply a symbolic gesture. Which that would, if we were to make sure that, well, we have to then wait, we break it, right? And now we put it out. We don't actually, no one I've seen ever that does that actually does it entirely as distribution. It's just a symbol. It's a symbolic kind of gesture, and we need to understand. I just want to make sure you understand that that's not what it's really talking about, but that exists. So now let's get to what the important part is of when he says this. He says, "Take, eat." Two commands. So he has made this available. Now he is saying, you take it and eat it. Okay, so, all right, he's just putting it out there. They're all then on that table, and the way in which they were constructed, there would have been kind of a reclining kind of situation. He's kind of offering it around. In other words, don't let Renaissance art get in the way, okay, of how you think. Okay, that's not right. Okay. Notice what he says, oh, here's what you're doing. That's just, notice, a physical behavior. Take, eat. Now this matters when we get to the question of worship. There is a physical portion to this of an actual behavior we are to undergo. Take, eat. But there's also purpose that is given by God for the action. And he says that next. This is my body, which is broken for you. There's the figure. Do this in remembrance of me. So he provides the figure, which we'll get back to, but the purpose is, do this in remembrance of me. That's that next command. Take, eat, do. What we're just doing is to be done with a particular purpose. What is the purpose that he cites? Remembrance. It's the night of the betrayal. What are they to remember? What would they have thought about this when he said it originally? No, I think you're right. I think that this kind of struck them afterwards. Remember me. Do this in remembrance of me, so you can remember me. Well, he's right there with them. But he is also, in that sense, you see, I want you to be able to do this, and when you go through it, and I realize what we're doing is we're looking at it through Paul's lens, looking back at what Jesus was thinking and doing, and the apostles who were thinking other things. So we've got multiple layers here to all of this. But when Jesus is saying this, he knows what he's about to do. He knows he's about to be gone. What we haven't had yet is the discussion that's about to happen, if you go through and look, that begins, let not your heart be troubled, in John 14. So this actually, in a way, is the beginning step of reminding them what he said, and now's the time. I'm going away. He started by telling them to remember him. And I don't know, we often have made that connection that he's all that night. This starts after he's completed the Passover, remembering properly as his responsibility as a Jew would have been, to now everything attention at this moment as he cuts away from that and starts something that's going to be new. He's now focused entirely on what he's going to be doing for them and preparing them for his absence. And that this was a first step. This is my body. Okay, we know it's unleavened bread. He says, this is my body. Now, if you have any background, if you've come from denominational background, you are aware of a huge argument on this. Okay, moving on. Okay. Okay, good. The big, if y'all don't know what the argument is, the difference between, big words coming, warning, alert, transubstantiation and consubstantiation. All right? Trans meaning it changes, con means with. And I believe the main argument, if memory serves, between the way the Catholics looked at it and then later the Lutherans was a big issue. Okay, so does it change into the actual body? Or is it with the body, it's kind of tied to it? Neither one apparently can appreciate metaphor, which is what this is. This is my body. Jesus was still alive when he said this. His body was right there. The bread was separate. It's a figure. But it has a lot of meaning as a figure I want us to think about. When he says, this is my body, he's going to say, which is broken for you, which is tying in with the bread, in a sense. But therefore it has a double meaning, because the idea of your body being broken is actually more about just being worn down, give up, that kind of thing. But what does it mean that this is my body? Why make that part of what he wants you to remember? I thought I saw a hand. John? Say that again. There's no life. It's unleavened. It's no life. But why the body? What does that body actually signify? Broader meaning that I don't think we appreciate. We don't incorporate it into how we think about this, because it's something we just take for granted. Right? Yeah. It's the incarnation itself. Jesus is God who has a body. And of all the things that God could do with that body, the most important thing he did was die. It's the actuality of it. It's the fact. Nothing else is going to matter. The fundamental fact of Christianity depends upon God became man. that doesn't happen, none of the rest of this happens. And so to recognize at the bread the humanity of Jesus while being God, that he came, and yes, which is broken for you, he came to die. But because he does it in this way, it also opens up a reminder of the nature of the death depended completely on the nature of the life. The meaning of what he accomplished in death was dependent on how he lived his life. Right? You don't get a death with that kind of meaning except you have a life of that kind of quality. Right? It's good. He had to come. The purpose of the coming was for our benefit, that we are the ones who are going to benefit from that, because he had a body that he could give to die. It was essential. But the life, what made it powerful was it was perfect as a life. Now, he goes into this in Hebrews a greater extent in chapter 10. But you have this idea of when you're partaking to realize what God had to do for you. And it's, yes, this is about the cross, but it's about the one on the cross. And therefore it's about what makes what happened on the cross do what it does and accomplish what it does is because of who Jesus is. Say who he is and how he is. That he is God who took on flesh, and in doing so still maintained holiness so that that death could have power for us. How many people do you think have been crucified before Jesus? Likely. I mean, you started with the Assyrians doing that. The Romans certainly did many. Don't even know what the full count was just with the Spartacus rebellion. This was just a given. But you don't have some record because that was what was done for the worst of criminals. It didn't accomplish anything other than, they'd say, rid society of that problem. It was who Jesus is and how he lived that then makes this powerful. And I want, when we think about in the Lord's Supper, it is helpful to remember not just a death occurred, but who died and why. And what it took in life for this to have the power it has and value for us. That needs to be part of this. God had to become a baby and go through all of that, all through the growing up, and keep himself pure. And then on taking, after 30 years of that, take on this responsibility as the Messiah, which meant not just teaching, it meant going to the cross. And to remember he did this for you is a key part of what we're doing in the Lord's Supper. Verse 25. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Now, we can get some other things that come up from this that are kind of interesting. He took the cup. It says the same manner, so all the same things go in the same way. He took the cup after supper. Now that we bypass that. After supper matters. That little short phrase, that really matters. It says after supper. Because it's showing there was a distinction that Jesus made between the Passover meal and what he was doing. The Passover meal was complete. He's doing something different. Why is that important? Yeah, this is going to be, we're starting a new covenant. It's also pertinent today because in the last several years, and I can actually remember one instance goes back a couple of decades, but where people have decided that the Lord's Supper is too stodgy, and so we're going to reinfuse it with a lot more of a meal kind of flavor in the original context of the Jewish Passover. In other words, they decided to go full Corinth. And they missed the point, and so to make it a celebration, they actually reverted back and not appreciating, okay, if we're going to go back to that context, you're taking it out of a Passover context, which we don't celebrate because we're not Jews. And then failing to learn from what the Corinthians were doing, and that he was deliberately making this distinction in what he was doing, that it wasn't part of the meal. And remember what just we went over last week was the problem for the Corinthians, was confusing that. Paul is clarifying that for them too. It was after supper. It was distinct. Then we have, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Now this leads to a different problem for division, and that is, how many cups can you have? Because he had one cup, apparently from the way they're reading this. He took the cup, and so this do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. My question simply is this, is when he drank the cup, what exactly was going into his stomach? Was it going the contents of the cup, or was the cup like somehow itself going down his throat? I know it sounds ridiculous, y'all, but this is a real problem. Okay, to appreciate, it's the way in which you speak. And sometimes what we do is we fail to appreciate simply the way speech works when we go full on literal rather than literary. Okay. Literally, it says he drank the cup. In a literary, that is just a reading and how words are used fashion, he drank what was in the cup. Now, that's actually, and those are kind of, it's interesting what we'll get caught up on in a text. I say interesting in the way of, isn't this sad? Because there's something far better here and worthwhile in the way he words this. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. How is that different from saying this cup is my blood? Because go back and look and compare it to what he did with the bread. This is my body, which is broken for you. Here he says, this is the new covenant in my blood. What is the distinction between those different phrases, and why did he choose this? We're putting away the old? Yeah, he's signifying that certainly by the new covenant. But he hasn't died yet. You see how all of this is looking at that next day? What has to happen for there to be a new covenant? You have to have the death of the testator. So you combine the idea of blood, and now what's significant about blood that we see going back into the Old Testament? Life is in the blood. And the writer of Hebrews reminds us that there, in chapter 9, verse 22, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission, no forgiveness. So he is tying this together, that this is the new covenant in my blood. So he's given us significance in the same way that the significance of his incarnation is implied. He's now being direct to give the significance in the blood. And what we should be reminded of in the partaking of the Lord's Supper, in what the fruit of the vine represents. And that is, we have a new covenant because of a death that happened. Jesus had to come, God had to come as a man, and God had to give his life as a man in order to produce a new covenant that would provide for all mankind the forgiveness of sins. The only reason we can exist with any meaning is because of what Jesus came to do and then did. So when we come together and we partake of the Lord's Supper, this is a statement of our origin story. This is why we even exist as a people, because of what Jesus did. He had to come. He had to be willing to die, and with that was able to create a new covenant for all men, to govern all men, to create a new people among men who are forgiven by God. And that's what is contained within unleavened bread and fruit of the vine, properly remembered. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. He does it as often as, which Eddie mentioned as well, the idea of, he doesn't actually deal with time here, but he does deal with it's going to be regular, some way. But he doesn't tell them how much. And without a time, you don't know what you're going to, when the next time is. You don't have any of that information given. That was given later. It was given to them at Pentecost. We don't have the record of it until Acts 20 and verse 7. It's the first day of the week. And that was the as often as. Again, in remembrance of me. This is what makes it worship. You have your attention and your mind through a divinely appointed activity being directed toward God. I want you to note something else, though, in this. This is one specifically directed to Jesus, toward Jesus. And that means then that in worship, in how God has given it, that it's important to direct those things appropriately, and that he does have distinctions. It would be the wrong, in other words, to remember in the Lord's Supper, our attention is not to be on the Holy Spirit, it's not on the Father. It's on Jesus and what Jesus himself did. It's still worship because Jesus is God. But what happens a lot of times when we discuss worship, we kind of get everything so mushy, and we just kind of throw God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit all together in a blob and worship, and it's something. Instead of appreciating that there's actually, it's only understood by the nature of what worship is, which is specific activity to be pleasing to God, something he has given that is directed to him toward deity for the purpose of displaying reverence. So the attitude, approved action, directed toward God, deity, that's essential for something to be worship. It's just not something we throw around. Part of the problem is translations that do not help us because they translate many different words as being worship, when in actuality, really probably only proskuneo should be translated as worship. And you end up with confusion as a result of translation. Yes, John? Yes. Yes. No, okay, good question. What we're going to get to more of this. Does the way we do it change anything about this? I mean, as far as, are you partaking of the Lord's Supper? Are you taking of unleavened bread? Are you taking of? Okay. The only question about how we do it has to do with the distribution of it, right? So the question would be similar to how many cups, or whether or not it has to be broken in process rather than done previously. After that, it's just about distribution. And here the thing is that is not actually addressed here, other than Jesus made it available. So that part is not a problem. It's actually a really good question, because we need to make sure that anything we do, that we are considering how it ought to be done. Okay. But then within, okay, does it fulfill this? Do we fulfill this? How does that work? Now there's still room for what do we consider best. That's for the elders. Trust me, they've thought a lot about this, of what would be best for a number of reasons. And so we'll get into that some more, but we need to understand what is violated in this. Same way as it came up when people, goes way back, when we came out with the trays that had the multiple cups on it. That was an innovation, right? But it didn't change what was done as far as the contents. One. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. That is an existence. That is a question that goes back a long time ago, and so you have to cover it, and to cover the hermeneutics of it. Okay, that was the bell. Hannah, I may have to do this next week. Quickly. Yes. Yeah. Quality too, yeah. Yeah, that's a process and nuance I'm not sure we're ready for. Very good. All right, we will pick up there next week. I was so ambitious and thinking I could get all the way through verse 26. I blame the silences. Anyway, very good. Appreciate all your attention and your comments.